The warm sunlight filtered through the vibrant tents set up for Asante's wedding. Guests dressed in bold African prints laughed as the rhythms of traditional drummers filled the air. Kalechi stood among the groom's friends, his simple but neat suit making him stand out for his humility rather than wealth. It wasn't often he attended grand celebrations like this, but he couldn't miss his friend's big day. As he surveyed the crowd, his eyes fell on a woman on the bride's side, a striking figure in a stunning dress, her radiant smile lighting up the room. For a moment, the chatter and music around him faded. Kalechi couldn't take his eyes off her. "Who is she?" he whispered to a friend, but no one seemed to know. Mustering his courage, he made his way through the laughing and dancing guests until he stood before her. "Hi," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "I'm Kalechi. You're here for the bride." Nyasha barely glanced at him, her expression polite but distant. "Yes, Asante is a close friend," she replied lightly, her tone uninterested. Kalechi smiled, undeterred. "She's lucky to have a friend like you. You look amazing, by the way." Nyasha gave a faint smile, still looking elsewhere, unimpressed by the attention. Despite her aloofness, Kalechi pressed on, drawn to something he couldn't quite explain. "I know it's a wedding and all, but would you let me buy you coffee tomorrow?" he asked, his heart pounding. Nyasha paused, her gaze finally meeting his. There was something genuine in his eyes, something different. "Sure," she said after a moment, though her voice lacked enthusiasm. She scribbled down a number and handed it to him. Kalechi felt a rush of excitement, unaware that Nyasha had given him the contact for a food delivery service instead of her real number. As their conversation ended, Nyasha adjusted herself to wheel away, and Kalechi noticed for the first time that she was in a wheelchair. His expression shifted, unable to hide his surprise. Nyasha caught the change, but acted as if she didn't notice. Kalechi hesitated, conflicted by his feelings. Moments later, he walked to a nearby trash can and dropped the piece of paper with her number inside. Nyasha, from the corner of her eye, saw him do it. Her heart ached for a moment, but she pushed the feeling aside. This wasn't the first time someone had judged her this way. Smiling brightly, she turned back to enjoy the wedding, determined not to let his reaction ruin her evening. It had been weeks since the vibrant wedding, but for Kalechi, life had returned to its usual struggles. Work was scarce, and the little money he earned from odd jobs barely covered his rent. One quiet morning, as he flipped through an old newspaper at the corner kiosk, his eyes caught a small ad. "Driver needed. Experience required. Apply immediately." Kalechi's heart leapt. This could be the break he was looking for. He straightened his shoulders, determined to try. Pulling out the only suit he owned, old but clean, and his neatly folded driving license, he prepared himself for the interview. The address led Kalechi to an estate unlike anything he'd ever seen. The gates were tall, adorned with intricate designs, and the driveway stretched far, lined with manicured gardens and luxury cars. His nerves flared as he stepped out of the public transport he'd taken to get there. Adjusting his tie, he approached the main entrance. A housekeeper directed him to an office where Jabari, the estate's owner, was waiting. The room was as intimidating as its occupant. Towering bookshelves, a massive oak desk, and a man with an aura of authority seated behind it. Jabari's sharp eyes looked Kalechi up and down. "You're here for the driver position?" he asked, his voice steady and commanding. Kalechi nodded, presenting his license and experience with confidence despite his nerves. "I've worked as a driver for private clients before," he explained. "I'm punctual, careful, and dedicated." Jabari listened intently, occasionally glancing at the papers in his hand. After a few moments of silence, he leaned back in his chair. "You seem capable," Jabari said. "The job is more than just driving. It's about trust. My daughter has strict medical appointments, and I need someone reliable to ensure she gets where she needs to go." Kalechi agreed earnestly, unaware of who Jabari's daughter was. Jabari stood, signaling the interview's end. "You'll start today. She's waiting outside." As Kalechi walked out to the car, his breath caught. Sitting beside the vehicle in her wheelchair was Nyasha. She was dressed elegantly, her posture confident and calm. For a moment, Kalechi froze, memories of the wedding flooding back. Nyasha looked up and smirked, her sharp gaze meeting his. "So you're the new driver?" she asked, her tone casual but laced with amusement. Kalechi stumbled for words, surprised and embarrassed. "Ah, yes," he finally managed, unsure of what else to say. Nyasha didn't give him much time to recover, gesturing toward the car. Well, let's not be late. My father doesn't like delays. As he helped her into the car, the tension between them was palpable, though neither acknowledged their shared past yet. The car hummed softly as Kalechi drove Nyasha to the hospital. He stole occasional glances at her in the rearview mirror, her calm composure a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts in his head. He wanted to say something, anything, to address the awkwardness lingering between them since the wedding. About the coffee, he began, his voice hesitant. Nyasha didn't look up from her phone, but her expression tightened slightly. I lost your number, Kalechi continued, forcing a smile. That's why I didn't call. I was really looking forward to meeting you. Nyasha lowered her phone, finally meeting his gaze in the mirror with a faint smirk. Oh, I know where you lost it, she said evenly. In the trash. Right after you realized I'm in a wheelchair. Her words hit Kalechi like a slap, and for a moment he couldn't think of a reply. Nyasha shrugged lightly, her tone almost casual. It wasn't even my number anyway. I gave you the contact for a food delivery service. I don't just hand out my real number to strangers. Kalechi's cheeks burned with embarrassment and guilt. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, unable to find the right words to defend himself. The car rolled to a stop outside the hospital. Kalechi quickly stepped out and opened the door for Nyasha, offering a hand to help her out of the car. I can manage, Nyasha said firmly, brushing past his outstretched hand. With practiced ease, she maneuvered herself out and adjusted her wheelchair. Her independence was clear, but there was an edge to her actions, as if daring him to challenge her. Kalechi stood awkwardly to the side, unsure of what to do. I'll wait here, he said quietly, feeling a need to show he wasn't entirely dismissive of her. Nyasha turned her wheelchair toward the hospital entrance and paused briefly. Without looking back, she said in a tone both matter-of-fact and dismissive, You can wait here, or leave. I'll be fine either way. Her words stung more than Kalechi expected. He watched her wheel herself away, her head held high, her confidence unshaken. For a moment, he thought about getting back into the car and driving off, but something stopped him. Instead, he leaned against the car and watched her until she disappeared through the sliding doors. The sting of her words lingered, but so did a growing sense of respect for her strength. As the minutes turned into hours, Kalechi found himself sitting on the hood of the car, lost in thought. The heat of the day melted the ice cream he'd bought from a street vendor, but he hardly noticed. Nyasha's words from earlier echoed in his mind. You can wait here, or leave. Her tone hadn't been bitter, but it carried a weight that unsettled him. He thought about how he had judged her the day of the wedding, discarding her number and assuming her disability defined her. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he'd been. Nyasha wasn't looking for pity or approval. She simply wanted to be seen for who she was. When Nyasha emerged from the hospital doors, the sunlight caught the confidence in her stride as she wheeled herself forward. Kalechi straightened, feeling nervous but determined. He held up a small tub of ice cream, a playful smile on his face. I thought you might want one, he said, walking toward her. Nyasha raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smile. You thought right, but I can buy my own ice cream. Thank you very much. Kalechi laughed, scratching the back of his head. Fair enough. Maybe you'll let me share the shade of this car, though? Nyasha shrugged, accepting his lightheartedness, and the moment passed without tension. The drive back to the estate was quieter than their earlier ride, but this time the silence felt less strained. Kalechi glanced at Nyasha through the mirror and finally spoke. I need to say this. I'm sorry for how I acted before, at the wedding and today. You deserve better than that. Nyasha didn't look at him but responded calmly, I already forgave you. Surprised, Kalechi turned to her briefly, his grip on the steering wheel loosening. Really? He asked, a hint of hope in his voice. Nyasha nodded. But forgiveness doesn't mean much if you haven't learned anything, and it doesn't mean we're suddenly friends. Her tone was firm but not cold, her boundaries clear. As they approached the gates of the estate, Kalechi realized the depth of her strength, not just in how she handled herself, but in how she dealt with others. Nyasha had been judged and dismissed before, but she didn't let it define her. Thank you for saying that, Kalechi said as he parked the car. I hope I can earn your trust someday. Nyasha opened the door on her own and maneuvered her wheelchair out, waving off his attempt to assist. Our relationship is professional, Kalechi. Let's keep it that way, she said with a faint smile. Yet, as she disappeared into the house, Kalechi couldn't help but feel a shift, a small, hopeful opening that hadn't been there before. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the estate. Kalechi stood by the car, carefully scrubbing away the dust and polishing every surface until it gleamed. Though the work wasn't glamorous, he approached it with quiet pride. From the window of her room, Nyasha leaned on the sill, her gaze fixed on him. There was something about the way Kalechi worked, steadfast, focused, that caught her attention. It wasn't pity or admiration, but a simple acknowledgement of his effort. She turned away before he could glance up and see her watching. A firm knock on her door startled Nyasha from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, and her father entered, his imposing presence filling the room. Jabari rarely visited her room unless it was something important. "How's the new driver?" he asked, sitting down in the chair near her bed. His tone was casual, but Nyasha knew him too well. He was gauging her response. "He's fine," she replied evenly, not offering more. Jabari raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Fine? That's it? You usually don't approve of anyone so quickly. What's different about this one?" Nyasha shrugged, her expression calm. "He does his job and he doesn't hover. That's all I need." Jabari studied her, his sharp eyes searching for hidden meaning in her words. He was used to her rejecting drivers for being too invasive, too talkative, or simply not understanding her independence. He murmured, leaning back in his chair. "You're not usually this easy to please, Nyasha. I wonder what's moved you to accept him so quickly." She gave him a faint smile but didn't elaborate, and he didn't press further. As Jabari stood to leave, his gaze softened, a rare moment of vulnerability crossing his face. "You know, I only want what's best for you," he said quietly. "You're the only family I have left after your mother." His voice trailed off, thick with emotion. Nyasha felt a pang in her chest but didn't respond. She knew her father meant well, but his overprotectiveness often felt suffocating. Jabari's mind drifted to memories of his late wife, whose death had left him clinging tightly to their daughter. With a heavy sigh, he added, "If he's working for you, then he's working for me too. Let me know if he ever steps out of line." Nyasha nodded, watching as he left the room, the weight of his love and expectations lingering behind. The library was one of Nyasha's favorite places, a peaceful refuge filled with shelves of stories and knowledge. Kalechi parked the car and followed her inside, keeping a respectful distance as she moved effortlessly between aisles in her wheelchair. As Nyasha scanned the titles, Kalechi casually browsed a nearby shelf, trying to make himself useful without hovering. His fingers paused over a familiar book, a novel he had read countless times during quiet nights at home. Before he could pick it up, Nyasha reached for the same book. Their eyes met, and she raised an eyebrow. "You've read this?" she asked, holding it up. Kalechi nodded, a sheepish grin on his face. "Yeah, it's one of my favorites. The way the author describes overcoming challenges, it really stuck with me." Nyasha tilted her head, intrigued. "And what challenges are you overcoming, Kalechi?" she asked, her tone light but curious. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Life, I guess. It's not always easy, but books like this remind me to keep going." For the first time, Nyasha saw another layer to Kalechi, someone thoughtful and introspective. She smiled faintly. "That's why I like it too. It's a reminder that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet." Their conversation deepened as they discussed the characters and themes, an unexpected connection forming between them. On the way back, the mood in the car was lighter than ever. They joked about the book's ending, laughing at how overly dramatic one of the characters had been. By the time they reached the estate, the sound of Nyasha's laughter filled the air. For once, she wasn't guarded or distant, and Kalechi felt at ease in her presence. As they parked and made their way inside, they didn't notice Jabari standing in the hallway, watching them with curious eyes. "What's all this laughter about?" he asked, his deep voice cutting through their chatter. Both turned, startled, but Nyasha's smile didn't fade. "It's nothing, Baba," she said lightly. "Kalechi and I just found out we like the same book." Jabari's stern expression softened as he looked at his daughter. It had been a long time since he'd seen her laugh like this, her face glowing with genuine happiness. "The same book?" he repeated, a note of surprise in his voice. Nyasha nodded, her tone teasing. Yes, Baba. Some people do read for fun, you know. Jabari chuckled, shaking his head. It's good to see you happy, Nyasha, he said, his voice filled with warmth. For a moment, the tension between father and daughter seemed to ease. Jabari gave Kalechi a quick nod before heading to his study, leaving the two to exchange a glance that carried both relief and amusement. Kalechi couldn't ignore the shift in his feelings. Every shared conversation, every fleeting glance at Nyasha added to the growing warmth in his chest. Yet he knew his place. She was his employer's daughter, and her world was far removed from his. Nyasha, too, felt something stirring. Kalechi's sincerity and unspoken kindness had begun to break through the walls she had built around herself. But she had grown skilled at keeping her heart guarded, especially after years of being treated differently because of her disability. Both of them, bound by unspoken rules and fears, refused to acknowledge what was happening between them. One afternoon, as Kalechi prepared the car for Nyasha's hospital visit, he heard voices drifting from the living room. Peeking in through the slightly open door, he saw Jabari sitting with Nyasha and a well-dressed man, Baraka. Nyasha, her father began in his commanding tone, Baraka has expressed interest in marrying you. He comes from a good family and will provide you with the stability you need. Nyasha's face was calm, but her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. Kalechi watched from the shadows, his heart sinking as he saw the sadness in her eyes. She didn't argue or protest, simply nodding at her father's words. Unable to bear her silence, Kalechi stepped into the room. Excuse me, sir, he said politely, addressing Jabari. It's time for Nyasha's hospital appointment. Jabari frowned slightly, waving a dismissive hand. We're discussing something important, Kalechi. Wait outside. Kalechi hesitated, then glanced at Nyasha, silently asking for her permission. She met his gaze, and something in her expression softened. I think Kalechi's right, Baba. We should go now. The doctors don't like it when I'm late. Jabari sighed, clearly annoyed, but didn't press further. Nyasha turned her wheelchair toward the door, leaving her father and Baraka to continue their conversation. As Kalechi drove her to the hospital, the tension in the car was palpable. Nyasha finally broke the silence, her voice tinged with weariness. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Kalechi glanced at her in the mirror, his grip tightening on the wheel. I couldn't just stand there and watch, he admitted. You didn't look happy. Nyasha sighed, staring out the window. It's not about being happy. It's about what's expected of me. Kalechi's chest tightened at her words, but he said nothing. Deep down, he wanted to tell her how he felt, but the moment wasn't right. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, vowing to be there for her in whatever way he could. The car hummed softly as they neared the hospital, but the silence between Kalechi and Nyasha was heavy. Suddenly, Nyasha spoke, her voice strained. Stop the car. Kalechi glanced at her in surprise, but pulled over. What's wrong? He asked, concern etched in his voice. Nyasha pressed a hand to her chest, her breathing uneven. I can't keep doing this, she whispered. These hospital visits, these treatments, what are they even helping? She looked away, her eyes distant and tired. Kalechi, she said after a pause, I don't want to go there today. Take me somewhere else, anywhere you choose. Kalechi hesitated, but then nodded. Turning the car around, he drove without saying a word. He remembered a place he used to visit as a child, a quiet hilltop at the edge of the city, where the air was clear and the view stretched far. As they climbed the winding road up the mountain, Nyasha stared out the window, her face calm but thoughtful. When they finally reached the top, the city sprawled beneath them, tiny buildings glittering under the afternoon sun. Kalechi parked the car and stepped out, breathing deeply. Come, he said gently. Nyasha wheeled herself out of the car, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The beauty of the view said everything. After a long silence, Nyasha began to speak. Her voice was soft, but the weight of her words carried years of pain. I was 12 when it happened, she said, staring at the horizon. We were driving back home from visiting my grandparents. It was raining, and the road was slippery. The car lost control. She paused, swallowing hard as tears welled in her eyes. When I woke up, I couldn't feel my legs. They told me my mother didn't survive the crash. She died trying to protect me. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she brushed it away angrily. Since then, it's just been my father and me. He's so afraid I'll be alone forever. I think he blames himself, so he tries to fix it. He tries to fix me. Nyasha's voice trembled, but she kept going, her words spilling out as if they'd been trapped for years. My father, he invites men to the house all the time. Sons of his business partners, old family friends. I think he pays them to talk to me, to pretend to care. He just wants me to be happy. I don't blame him for it, but it hurts. She looked at Kalechi then, her eyes searching his face. Do you know what it's like to feel like a burden? To feel like people only see what's wrong with you? Kalechi's heart ached for her. He stepped closer, crouching beside her wheelchair. I see you, Nyasha, he said quietly. Not for what happened to you, but for who you are. Nyasha's tears finally spilled freely as she let herself cry, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. After Nyasha finished her story, tears quietly streaming down her cheeks, Kalechi didn't speak. He simply reached over and gently held her hand. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was understanding. The night air was cool, and the view from the mountaintop stretched endlessly under the dark sky. I'm sorry, Kalechi finally said, his voice low but sincere. You've been carrying that alone for so long. But one day, I promise, you'll be happy. The right time always comes. Nyasha looked at him, surprised by the warmth in his words. For the first time in years, she felt like someone truly understood. Taking a deep breath, Kalechi turned his gaze to the distant city lights. You've shared your story. I think it's only fair I tell you mine, he said softly. Before he could continue, a sudden rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, and raindrops began to fall. Neither of them moved as the soft rain misted their faces, the world around them hushed and still. I never knew my parents, Kalechi began. They died when I was little, too little to even remember their faces. My grandmother raised me. She did everything she could for me, even when we had nothing. His voice was calm, but Nyasha could hear the weight of his words. I started working as soon as I was old enough. I took any job I could find, driving, fixing things, just to take care of her. Nyasha watched him closely, her heart aching for the boy Kalechi once was. Where is she now? She asked quietly. Kalechi smiled faintly, his gaze steady. She's in the hospital. She got very sick a while ago, and I thought I'd lose her. But now she's getting better. This job, driving you, has helped me pay for her treatment. For that, I'm grateful. Nyasha's eyes widened. I didn't know, she murmured, suddenly feeling a deep respect for him. You're always smiling. How can you carry all that and still be happy? Kalechi's smile grew, and he turned to her. Because pain is a choice, he said simply. You can let it bury you, or you can rise above it. I choose to be happy. I choose to believe that the right time will come, and things will get better. The rain fell harder as the night stretched on, the sound of droplets tapping against the car creating a soft rhythm. They spoke for hours, about life, about loss, and about dreams they'd never admitted to anyone else. By the time Kalechi checked the time, dawn was breaking on the horizon. The city below glowed softly in the morning mist. We've been here all night, Kalechi said, turning to Nyasha with a chuckle. Nyasha smiled, looking more at peace than she had in years. Take me home, Kalechi, she said gently. As they drove back, the movement of the car lulled Nyasha to sleep. Kalechi glanced at her in the mirror, her head tilted slightly, her breathing soft. For the first time, Kalechi felt something deeper shift in his heart, and he smiled quietly to himself as the sun rose, painting the sky with hope. Jabari hadn't slept. The living room was dark, except for the faint glow of his phone as he tried calling Nyasha again. No answer. He paced the floor, his mind spiraling with worry. Where could she be? Why hadn't Kalechi brought her home? When the first rays of dawn peeked through the curtains, Jabari walked to the window, his heart stopping as he finally saw them pull into the driveway. Relief washed over him, but his expression softened into curiosity as he observed them closely. Nyasha was still asleep in the car, her head resting lightly against the seat. Kalechi got out quietly and looked around the garden. Jabari frowned but stayed silent, watching. Kalechi spotted a small rose blooming near the edge of the garden. Smiling to himself, he picked it carefully, brushing off the dew, and walked back to the car. Opening Nyasha's door, he crouched slightly and held the rose near her face. Good morning, he said softly. Nyasha stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and she blinked at the flower before looking up at him. Morning, she mumbled, a small smile pulling at her lips. We're here, Kalechi said gently, standing back and letting her take in her surroundings. Through the window, Jabari's eyes narrowed, but then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Finally, he muttered to himself, his tone filled with relief and something deeper, perhaps hope. Kalechi walked to the back of the car and brought out Nyasha's wheelchair, unfolding it with careful precision. Nyasha watched him silently, something soft in her gaze. When he returned to her side, she surprised him by saying, "Will you help me get in?" Kalechi paused, his eyebrows raising slightly before his face softened. "Yeah, sure," he replied warmly. Nyasha nodded, her voice quieter than before. "Okay." For the first time, she let someone help her, not because she couldn't do it herself, but because she wanted to. As Kalechi gently picked her up, cradling her carefully, he murmured, "Be careful." Nyasha replied, "Yeah," her voice barely audible as she held on to him. As Kalechi placed her gently into the wheelchair, they both paused. Their faces were close, too close. They could feel each other's breath, their noses brushing lightly. Neither of them moved until, suddenly, Kalechi leaned in. Nyasha didn't pull away. Their lips met in a soft, tentative kiss, lingering for a few seconds as the world around them seemed to fall away. "You're fired," Nyasha said suddenly, her voice steady but her face a mix of emotions she couldn't hide. Kalechi laughed softly, brushing off her words. "Don't joke like that," he said, looking down at her with the same calm smile he always wore. But her expression didn't change. "Put me down," she said firmly. Something about her tone made him pause. He realized she wasn't joking. "Okay," he said softly, placing her gently into her wheelchair, his movements careful and tender. Once she was seated, he crouched down to look her in the eye. "Tell me you're not joking," he said, his voice quieter now. Nyasha's face remained stoic, though tears threatened to break through her calm exterior. "My father will send you the money," she said, her voice distant and cold. Kalechi stared at her, confusion and hurt clouding his expression. "What's wrong? What's the matter?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Like Nyasha took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I should be home right now," she said quietly. "I have to get ready for dinner with my fiancé. It was nice to meet you." Without looking at him again, she wheeled herself toward the house, leaving Kalechi standing there, stunned, and speechless. Inside her room, Nyasha sat still for a moment, her hands shaking slightly. She had fired Kalechi, but her chest felt heavy, as though a part of her regretted it already. "Why did I kiss him?" she thought to herself, closing her eyes tightly. She moved toward the mirror, forcing herself to focus on the evening ahead, dinner with Baraka's family. Her father's proud face flashed through her mind. "He just wants the best for me," she thought, trying to convince herself. She picked out her finest dress and began to prepare, but the memories came flooding back. As Nyasha brushed her hair, she remembered how she and Kalechi had spent the night on the mountain, uh, sharing their stories, their pain, and their hopes. She could still hear his voice. Uh, Pain is a choice. I choose to be happy." The kiss replayed in her mind, making her heart ache. Tears finally slipped down her cheeks as the weight of it all hit her. "I just want to make Baba proud," she whispered to herself. "But will he ever accept that I feel something for my driver?" She wiped her tears quickly, telling herself to be strong. Nyasha looked into the mirror and whispered, "This is what's expected of me," though deep down, she wasn't so sure anymore. The dining hall was elegant, its grand table adorned with gold-trimmed plates, flickering candles, and beautiful flowers. Nyasha sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, her face calm but distant. Across from her, Baraka's parents chatted cheerfully with her father, Jabari, discussing plans for the future. Baraka was grinning, eager to impress Nyasha. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Baraka, could you bring me some ice cream?" Baraka's face lit up. "Of course," he said, standing up quickly. This was his moment. The ring was hidden on top of the ice cream, a surprise proposal meant to seal their future together. As Baraka disappeared into the kitchen, the room fell into a moment of quiet, filled only with the sound of clinking silverware. Suddenly, the door to the dining room opened, and Kalechi walked in. He was confident and calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. He strode toward Nyasha and, without hesitation, sat down in Baraka's empty chair. Nyasha's eyes widened in surprise. "Kalechi?" she whispered. Ignoring the stunned faces around him, Kalechi smiled softly and said, "My name is Kalechi, and I would like to know yours." Nyasha's lips parted, caught off guard. "It's Nyasha," she replied softly. "What a beautiful name," Kalechi said, his voice gentle. "It means kindness. doesn't it? Will you kindly share a coffee with me? Nyasha blinked, her heartbeat quickening as she stared at him. When? She asked, her voice barely audible. Now, Kalechi said, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. The entire room seemed to freeze. Baraka's parents exchanged confused glances, and Baraka's father opened his mouth to protest. Before he could speak, Jabari raised a hand and said firmly, "Let it be, please, quietly." His voice was calm but commanding, like leaving no room for argument. Jabari's gaze lingered on Nyasha and Kalechi, a smile slowly forming on his face. For the first time in years, he saw his daughter genuinely alive, her eyes bright and her guard lowered. The moment shattered when Baraka returned, holding a plate of ice cream with a sparkling ring delicately placed on top. "What is going on here?" Baraka demanded, looking between Nyasha, Kalechi, and Jabari. Before anyone could answer, Kalechi stood, his expression kind but firm. "I'm very sorry," Kalechi said. He stepped forward, took the ice cream gently from Baraka's hands, removed the ring, and placed it back in Baraka's palm. "This is yours," he said quietly. Turning back to Nyasha, he handed her the ice cream. "This is yours." Nyasha took it, her lips trembling into a smile. Kalechi gently took hold of Nyasha's wheelchair and began to push her away from the table, his movements steady and assured as they prepared to leave. He paused briefly, nodded politely to everyone at the table, and said, "Have a good evening." Jabari remained seated, watching them in silence, a faint but knowing smile lingering on his face. Turning to Baraka, he gestured toward the table and said, "Sit, son. I'll take care of your bill. Don't worry about it." With that, Nyasha and Kalechi exited the room together, their footsteps fading into the night, accompanied by the soft echoes of laughter and the quiet promise of newfound freedom.